Good morning. My name is Dr. Crystal Gale Fraser. I'm a historian at the University of Alberta on beautiful Treaty 6 lands. I was preparing this lecture for my history students over the weekend, and there was some outreach that some people may benefit from also being able to watch this lecture, and so I've decided to share it more broadly. I will say that I wrote this lecture yesterday, so on Sunday, October the 18th. Situations like this change quite rapidly. So this lecture's content is reflective of yesterday. So one thing I really encourage my history students to think about is what happens in modern Canada, what happens in a contemporary context is never an accident. There is always something in the past that happened that can help to explain what we're experiencing today. In this particular case, in Nova Scotia, between the Sipekne'katik First Nation and non-Indigenous fishers and their supporters, we can actually look back to the mid-18th century, 1760 and 1761, in order to understand that. But this morning, we're actually going to start back in 1993 with Donald Marshall Jr. He was arrested for catching and selling about 210 kilograms of eel with an illegal net without a license and during a time when the season was closed. So he was found guilty at the provincial court, and then the appeals court upheld that conviction. 1999, the case actually went to the Supreme Court of Canada, and what the Supreme Court of Canada did was it recognized the hunting and fishing rights that were promised in the peace and friendship treaties of 1760 and 1761. So very, very crucial. So the Supreme Court of Canada acknowledged the peace and friendship treaties, and then we can look to the Canadian Constitution under Section 35, which further protects treaty rights for Indigenous people in what is now known as Canada. So Mi'kmaq have a constitutionally protected right to fish for a moderate livelihood. Part of the problem is that the Supreme Court of Canada did not define what a moderate livelihood looks like, and that continues to be a problem today. But essentially, in a nutshell, what this means is that Mi'kmaq peoples have a right to fish and also sell that catch in order to support themselves. So moving ahead in time, what is happening in Nova Scotia right now? On September 17th, so about a month ago, was the 21st anniversary of the Supreme Court of Canada's decision in the Marshall case. And the Sipekne'katik First Nation decided to launch a self-regulated commercial fishery. And immediately there were accusations that they were operating this fishery in an illegal way. Again, just to remind you, Mi'kmaq peoples are constitutionally protected. Their rights are protected to fish and sell their catch. And so this is not only rooted in treaty, in the Supreme Court decision, in the Canadian Constitution, but the ability to manage resources actually goes back since time immemorial. And so they have been managing their own resources. This is rooted in tradition and culture and practice. And so this is something that they've been doing for centuries. That is a really key part of this story. There have also been questions about conservation. And so some of you may have seen this floating around social media. Dr. Megan Bailey at Dalhousie University says, if we look at kind of what the commercial effort is normally in that area, and it's hundreds of thousands of traps, the 250 traps going in right now, it is a negligible impact on the stock. And I don't think it's a conversation conservation concern at this scale. And so what the scientific evidence is really telling us is that there is no threat to lobster stocks. Again, they have a fisheries management plan in action, and the First Nation has only issued 7 licenses, which each allow for 50 traps. So again, the commercial fishery industry in this area allows up to 400,000 traps. And so the numbers are really not something that we can fairly compare. Again, important, the Sabaganagadi First Nation, Mi'kmaq peoples have been regulating their own resources according to their own law and legal order. And so that's very important. It's not as though these activities are happening without oversight or expertise. It's the Mi'kmaq peoples doing it themselves, acting as a sovereign nation as they are. Okay, so the result of this is that these Mi'kmaq fishers have been harassed. There have been flares that have been shot at their boats. Fishing lines have been cut. Some people have found themselves in violent altercations. We know about the fire that happened a few days ago. And this is from non-Indigenous fishers and supporters. And so there is a level of local violence that is happening here. And a part of the reason, which we're going to get into, is that when any Indigenous nation acts in a sovereign way, that basically undermines the legitimacy of the Canadian settler state. So I'm just going to talk about policing for a minute. There is a long history of policing in the country that we call Canada and Indigenous peoples. And so I just have a very, very short, condensed list here on the side that I will briefly go through. You can read through the points on your own. But turning to the right-hand side of the screen, some of you may have seen this image over social media on the weekend, and this is something that I really encourage my history students to consider. If you're in one of my history classes, you will recognize the image on the right. So 1872, kill every buffalo you can. Every buffalo dead is an Indian gone. When we compare that to what's happening today, a mob burned and vandalized vehicles outside a lobster pound in southwest Nova Scotia. And so when we talk about colonialism, when we talk about the suppression and oppression and genocide against Indigenous peoples, this is almost always linked back to the management of land and resources. So moving to the left-hand side of your screen, again, long history of policing in Canada, which first started by John A. Macdonald in 1873 when he established a paramilitary force. The next point here is 1990, but a lot happened between 1873 and 1990 when we think about policing, specifically, and speaking to the area of my expertise is that, you know, policing, the RCMP, the Northwest Mounted Police, removing Indigenous children from their home in order to institutionalize them at Indian residential schools. That would be one example, but there are many, many other examples between my points here of 1873 and 1990. We have the Oka crisis. You know, a couple years ago, we have the Gerald Stanley case. If you aren't familiar with that, I encourage you to look it up. There is a ton of resources, and specifically how the RCMP managed the investigation into the murder of Colton Boushie. Just earlier this year, we have the death of Chantel Moore in New Brunswick, where responders arrived on scene to do a wellness check, and this Indigenous woman ended up dead. You know, ongoing, unsolved, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls cases. You know, the RCMP have been criticized for not managing those properly. And I have here, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I definitely could go on. But the point here is that we have this very long history of policing not doing their job or due diligence or even following the law in relation to Indigenous peoples. Okay, so the role of the settler state and policing. And so here is a tweet from my colleague, Dr. Sean Carleton at the University of Manitoba. I will just read this to you. Canada, this is just a reminder from a friendly historian that the RCMP was literally created to check and suppress Indigenous resistance to colonization and capitalist accumulation. And so Sean was actually tweeting about something else there, but it is definitely relevant today, that the only reason why the police exist was to suppress Indigenous peoples, mostly in the West, during the second half of the 19th century. And so how does this relate here? You know, what is happening in Nova Scotia, the deployment of RCMP, where are they? Literally crickets. And here I have a screenshot from @PrivacyLawyer on Twitter. And this is an RCMP spokesperson who says, quote, "We don't see this as a police issue, but we understand both sides," end quote. Again, I'm not sure why violent attacks, why death threats, why fires would not be a police issue. But again, because policing in settler colonial states are always used to protect the interests of the state, i.e. not Indigenous peoples and our nations. If you're in one of my history courses, you will know that we talk about this on a theoretical level also, that violence is an essential tool to nation building and is strongly linked to othering and racialization. If you're new to those terms, I recommend that you look them up. I like to draw on the work of sociologist Richard Robbins when talking about how colonial nation states are constructed. And so I'm just gonna read you a quote here from a Richard Robbins textbook. He says, quote, "Yet there exists ample evidence that one of the ways states have sought to create nations is to eliminate or terrorize into submission those within its borders who refuse to assimilate or who demand recognition of their status as a distinct national or ethnic group," end quote. And so what we have here is the Mi'kmaq Nation, specifically the Sipekne'katik First Nation. And these First Nations are managed under the Indian Act. And so here I'm suggesting that there is a bigger, more sovereign nation. The Canadian settler state, it needs to use violence in order to suppress any distinct national or ethnic group. And so drawing from that quotation, nation states are seen as vehicles of modernity, progress, and civilization. And so in Canada, if you see Indigenous peoples who are acting in a sovereign way, who are acting out of step of how Canada wants them to manage themselves, they are always a threat to modernity, progress, and civilization. And so over the week, Jagmeet Singh did say that this is actually terrorism. The way non-Indigenous fishers and their supporters are treating this handful of Mi'kmaq fishers, that is terrorism. Where are the RCMP? Okay, moving on. This is one of the last slides of this lecture. What about the media interpretations around what is happening? So media has really framed this as a dispute between Mi'kmaq and non-Indigenous fishers. And so a dispute that's fairly neutral language. The reality is is that this issue speaks to the Crown's prolonged failure to recognize and implement Mi'kmaq commercial fishing rights. The media has not really explained the historical context, and so the treaties of 1760 to 61, how Mi'kmaq peoples have managed their own fisheries since then, but also even before, the Canadian Constitution, Section 35, and then the Marshall case in 1999. They've coined it as, nights of unrest, or a night of unrest, when in reality, this has been happening for weeks. Métis scholar Chelsea Vowell says if the roles were reversed, the army would already be there. Every news channel would be vilifying Indigenous peoples. And so this speaks to a bigger question of how we tell stories matter. The media has an ethical responsibility to tell these stories in an appropriate way, and so far we just haven't seen that. And I have a hyperlink here where you can read APTN journalist Trina Roach's assessment of the coverage. Okay, so I have some further reading here. These are largely history books or legal history books where you can read up on the historical contexts about treaties and the context in the Maritimes. And then I also have further reading for online sources. And so here, Pam Palmater, she is a Mi'kmaq lawyer, scholar, activist. I really encourage you to check out her website and her YouTube channel. She has a lot of great information. There is an NFB film here, Is the Crown at War with Us? So a lot of great resources out there to further educate yourself. Thank you very much for listening. Hi, and take good care, everyone. And please, if you're a Canadian, if you're non-Indigenous, if you don't know about these issues, please educate yourself, reach out to someone who can help you with that before making assumptions. Thank you very much.